What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Debbie Rowell YouTube channel. We're talking a little Dynasty Buys here as we head into the home stretch here of the contenders out there. Now we're starting to get where league placements at, where you are at in your leagues. You're looking at points for, points against. Who are some guys that can get you over the top to help you compete and head to the promised land, right? Get to the playoffs. So we're gonna be talking about a few things here. Number one, the first thing I want to kind of get into is what is a dynasty buy, right? You're going to hear that term a lot out there in fantasy. A lot of people are just going to use it for clicks. Hey, this is the guy you should get. But I think there's different windows, right? It all comes down to team needs, right? As a contender, when do you buy that running back that you probably need? You're sitting there at 4-2 or wherever you're at, and you're like, hey, I might need that running back, but I'm also fifth in the league. Do I give up capital for that guy? Will he put me over the top? So it really comes down to expectations. Look ahead in your schedule, see who you're playing, right? See if it was front loaded, you played like the toughest teams in the league early, and now you're kind of going down that middle stretch with some weaker teams that you could get wins on. I'd be more comfortable buying there right now. Let's say you've kind of beaten up on the weaker teams. Now you're heading into the stretch of like playing those tough teams. That might be where you don't want to give up first round capital, and then oh my gosh, you plummet down the ranks. Now you're looking at, you give up a top 5 pick for Derrick Henry. So there's really expectations there. How you looking? How am I going to buy? Where's my window of buying? All of that. Then there's different types of buys, right? Those 1-year rentals, those guys that probably going to retire, or the catering, right? We're going to talk about them on this episode of guys like, hey, I expect 1 year only, right? There could be increased competition next year. Maybe the injuries have just panned out perfectly for that person to where he's going to earn the targets. He's going to get the volume. And you're looking at it next year, like, I don't know if he's going to be here. He's going to retire, maybe new team, and it's just not going to be the same. And then the value dip, right? That you're buying at that guy's peak value. The other one is upside swings. Like, who are some guys that you feel like, hey, could take off that next kind of step here? Some guys like, I can target that kid. Jake Ferguson. We know Jake Ferguson from Dallas. We love him. Hey, he's still getting valued as a top 10 tight end, but I think he can get in the top 5. Or those upside swings for the youth players, those second-year guys, even those rookies that maybe haven't panned out yet, right? Jonathan Brooks, for example, maybe people expect him to really kind of take off. Or Trey Benson, who hasn't really gotten out there. Will he finally maybe get some volume at some point? So when you're thinking of upside swings, those are those guys either that haven't panned out yet, rookie, second-year players that you see a path for, and you think, hey, maybe he has it. Troy Franklin, for example, getting some targets out there in Denver now, right, from this last week. And it just depends on cost. Everything is just dependent on cost there. And in the 2-year window, guys that you think that, and we have a lot of them on this show today, guys that you think, hey, this year they can help me win and next year. So I'm okay giving up some type of capital this year because I know next year he's still going to give me some production from that capital I gave up. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at kind of how you buy these guys and what they are. They're all price dependent. We're going to be looking at what their prices are, real trades. So let's get into it. Kirk Cousins. So when you're talking about him as a super flex quarterback buy, right? So we're not always talking about quarterbacks on this channel. We're mostly talking about super flex. Don't do a lot of one quarterback. I think that he's a pretty good buy right now for a contender who is looking at that 2-year window, because I think that contract really locks him in for at least the next 2 years. He has started to kind of bounce back a little bit, right? He was QB1 against Tampa Bay. He did go back to where he's been at that QB 23 range or wherever that's been this year at Carolina. But I do think that offense is clicking, right? 9 touchdowns. You've seen 5 touchdowns the last 2 weeks. Obviously, you had that big game against Tampa. But QB 14 sitting there. I still think his value is pretty not depleted, but based on, hey, he's kind of sitting around that QB 20-ish mark, he could still get him for a second, as you see there, for a super flex quarterback. If you really need to go buy a quarterback at that position, you're looking for a guy that has some juicy matchups. So like, I think really when you're looking at it, like if I'm a contender, who's he playing? Seattle, great matchup. Tampa Bay, again, good matchup from what we just saw. Dallas, great matchup, especially with all the injuries that they've had. Micah Parsons, some of those other guys. And as a Dallas fan, he's going to tear their ass up. New Orleans, good matchup again. Denver, very good matchup, right? And then when you're looking at the playoffs, or whenever you guys start your playoffs, Las Vegas, the Giants, and Washington. He has a very, very good matchup-based season ahead of him, where I think that he can really contend here and he really help you win your league. And when you're looking at the value right now, second, Brandon Ayuk's a little pricey, depending on what your quarterback situation looks like. Cousins for a second and Zach Moss. I would do those deals. It's Sean Tucker in a second. Like, if you need a super flex quarterback, a 2-year window guy, a stopgap guy, right? You've kind of waited on that QB. You have a top 10 guy. You just need that second guy. Cousins is a perfect target out there to go get in your dynasty leagues. Now, the next one, this is that 1-year rental I was talking about, because I don't know if Matthew Stafford's coming back. I don't know if he's going to retire. I don't know what this coaching staff's going to look like. And again, he hasn't really been a solid fantasy quarterback, right? QB 29, 10.9 fantasy points. But here's the expectations that I have for him. Offense is coming back. It sounds like Cooper Kupp probably will be back. Puka Nacua is going to be coming back as well. So I think that when you're buying him super cheap, right? When you look at the deals here, Matt Stafford for Ben Simmons in the third, Matt Stafford for a second, Matt Stafford for Xavier Leggett. So if you're looking for a quarterback out there that is getting his offensive weapons back, who had showed last year down the stretch, he was a QB1, right? When he was a top 12 QB in fantasy. And I think that matchup wise too, Las Vegas, Minnesota has been really good this year. But then Seattle, Miami, New England, he's going to get some teams. And even in the playoffs, right? You're thinking like San Francisco is a tough one, but historically we've seen him do pretty well there. I mean, he had his touchdown this year. He finished his QB 22. But with his weapons back, he could be a QB1 in that game. And then at New York Giants and versus Arizona, like I think at that point, the Jets might be out. And then you got Arizona that last week. Like if you can get in the playoffs with him, I think he's a very solid QB2 in the format. And yeah, it's probably a 1-year rental, but if I can get him for Ben Simmons and a third, that 1-year rental could help you win your league. If you need that quarterback depth, that help, right? And you just ride him out to the sunset. Then if he comes back another year, that's expectations. That's, hey, okay, I bought him for this, expecting him to just be my 1-year guy. Now, whatever I get after that is added, right? And I think that's kind of how you look at Stafford. I do think the weapons coming back is going to help him, though, tremendously. Now, as far as the running back position, I mean, Derrick Henry, right? Let's just talk about Derrick Henry. Running back 2 right now on the board. When you see him, like he's been absolutely phenomenal. 96 total yards in 5 straight games. You have to love what he's been. I mean, he's got a tougher matchup this week against Tampa Bay, and you can see his value. Obviously, if you bought over the summer and you bought him before the season started, you were excited because you got him for cheap. Probably a second. I know I bought him for a second in the offseason last year. But when you see that, you're probably like, hey, he has that value. So this is a steep buy if you're looking at from what he previously was worth, right? But if you're a late first guy and you're looking at how many, he's got 119 carries already. And then against Washington, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns. He's a touchdown scoring machine, right? 8 touchdowns already. He's looked fantastic. Now he's not going to get the targets in the receiving game, but he doesn't have to. In PPR, I mean, he's a running back 2 already. Now as far as deals goes, this is where it'll vary depending on dynasty leagues. Derrick Henry for a first, then Derrick Henry for Rashee Rice. Rice, again, with the injury, I still will lean Rice there if I'm a rebuilder or like a mid-contender and I want to get, younger at that wide receiver position. I think that's a good deal. But that second deal is kind of the deal that you can try to make. Derrick Henry for Chase Brown and Tank Bigsby, especially for if Derrick Henry's sitting there on like a non-contending team and you're like, hey, what do you want? Here are some auxiliary pieces, some running back 2s with upside. Go do that deal, especially if you're a contender. Try to find ways that you can mitigate that risk, but also like, hey, you want this young piece? You want this guy that's kind of taken off a little bit? Go grab him right here. Here he is. And I think that's a great kind of strategy, especially for Chase Brown and Tank Bigsby. That doesn't move the needle. Now, will that be able to be done in your league? I'm not sure. It really depends. But the worst you could do is send it. If it gets declined, whatever. But I do think that he's value. I still think he's worth the late first if you're a contender and you need a running back and that value, especially with his volume that he's in. Now, next guy that I think, I've never been a big T. Higgins dynasty buy guy, but sitting there at wide receiver 22, I think is interesting. So since he's returned to the lineup, he's been about wide receiver 10 to 15, depending on when you're looking for points per game or total points. But 25% target share, air yard share is almost 40%. And that first read share that they have at fantasy points is really fun to look at. Even with Jamar Chase on the field, almost at 37%. I mean, that is pretty incredible. Red zone targets, he has 6, so he leads the team there. And when you're looking at that, like he has dominated this year. And I mean, when he's healthy, that's the key, right? 9th in points per game, 18th in air yards, 5th in target share in the league. So you have to love that as well. So I think moving forward, I like him as a buy because he is not just a 2-year window guy. He's a will he go somewhere in the offseason type of guy. But I think he's shown that he can, if he stays healthy, him and Jamar Chase can really work well with Cincinnati. That's the key, right? So if you're giving up a first for him, I understand it. I do think that, you're going to see that first. You're going to see that value there. Jordan Mason and Josh Downs, again, probably giving up that young piece that you're going to have to with Downs, with Richardson coming back. What does that look like for his fantasy perspective? I don't mind buying T. Higgins for that price. I like Downs. But if you're looking at a contender and you're looking at a guy that could be a wide receiver 1 on a roster, T. Higgins is that guy. And it's T. Higgins for Rashee Rice. I think this is the ultimate play here of who you believe in. I love Rashee. I was a huge buy Rashee before the season, which looked smart until he injured himself in that freak play. But if you want T. Higgins, you want that immediate production. And then I think that he can find a role if he goes somewhere in the offseason. It sounds like he is. That's the kind of deal that you have to make. Those are the buys that you make. Those are the decisions you have. But I think based on his schedule too, based on that really bad defense that they have, and just based on his performances, I think that you buy T. Higgins right now and you see what you can get, especially if it's a all right, let's talk our last buy here that we're going to go in detail with, and that's Terry McLaurin, Scary Terry. He was a guy that I was kind of high on in the beginning of the year, and even in the offseason. I was like, hey, you know what? Jaden Daniels' offense, I expected him to earn those targets. I expected him to come out and be possibly a wide receiver 1 in that offense. You can go check the tapes. I got the receipts out there. Then he came out with 4 targets that first week, and I was like, damn it, Scary Terry's burning me again. But you know what? He's bounced back, right? When you're looking at the targets there, 43. Keep trade cut. He's going back and forth, but he's still valued as a wide receiver 3/4. And I think that's a value there to go buy him, right? Terry McLaurin for Darnell Mooney in a second. I still like Scary Terry there. Terry for 225 seconds. Again, if you're a contender and you're looking for a wide receiver that's putting up wide receiver 1 type numbers, Scary Terry is the type of guy that I would go grab. And then Terry McLaurin for George Pickens, I think, is interesting because if you're a contender, the Pittsburgh offense is absolutely awful, right? When you think of the quarterbacks, the passing offense, I think Justin Fields is playing well enough for them to win. Now with Russell Wilson coming in the fold, what does that look like? I do think him and Pickens will work better together. But can you week in, week out be able to plug Pickens in your lineup? Maybe you want a Terry that has a safer floor and you're like, hey, I'm going to buy on this. And I think that's a good deal for both sides, like buying on upside for the George Pickens side, buying on that safe floor for the Terry side for a contender. And when you're looking at matchups, he has some pretty good matchups, but really it comes down to just, he's going to earn all the targets on this team. Like that's who he is. I think that there's no concern for him. I think that he is a locked in wide receiver 1/2 each week that he's out there. He's starting to earn the targets. He's starting to get the deep balls from Jaden Daniels as well. They're starting to incorporate in this offense. To me, he's great. If I can get him for any type of second plus something, I'm going to do that. If I don't have to give up a first, he's your cheaper option for a wide receiver that you don't have to give up there. And I look at him as being that 2-year window type of player. Now, last thing here I'm going to talk about, just some rapid fire buys, guys that I think I'm interested in there. Kelsey, let's ride this baby out, right? Let's talk about Travis Kelsey and we're just going to ride him out for this year. You know, when you're looking at overall, hasn't been the normal Travis Kelsey year, but the last 2 weeks, he's averaged 16 fantasy points. That would put him basically a tight end too. So he's back. He's kind of right in there in that PPR range. If you can get Kelsey on somebody's team that's maybe disappointing this year and you need a tight end, not a bad one. David Njoku, now that Amari Cooper is gone, you're looking at that offense, like who's going to get the targets there? Is it Judy? Is it Njoku? I think buying Njoku is not a bad deal. DeAndre Swift has looked good this year. I think he's got some fun matchups. If you want a cheaper running back than like, say, Derrick Henry, these guys, him and Najee Harris are great additions on your dynasty teams because I think that the cost of them is much cheaper than what you're getting for those top elite guys. And the production might generally be the same. You're still looking at maybe running back 1. It's not pretty. It's not amazing, but it scores you fantasy points. Then you got Christian Kirk out there. I'm always going to just include Christian Kirk. I still think that, you know, with Brian Thomas Jr. kind of arriving there, his price got even cheaper. When you're looking at it, he's been pretty consistent. He's averaging about 10 points, fantasy points per game, but he still earns those targets. Had he caught a couple touchdowns, he had opportunities last week, he would have definitely been in that wide receiver 1 type range. And Kirk to me is just a solid buy. I'd give up a late second for Christian Kirk if I need that value. I think he's still one of those 2-year asset type of guys that you can kind of buy out there. So appreciate you guys tuning in here to the Dynasty Buys. Let me know in the comments. You got some trades, drop them. I'll talk it out, especially before this week starts. And I will talk to you guys in the next episode.